Hey guys, tonight we sink into a story that presses at the edges of comfort. You're standing in the wide hall of a grand southern plantation house, chandeliers glowing overhead, polished floors reflecting golden light, and portraits of solemn ancestors staring down with that smug, "we built this empire" gaze. But while the surface looks like wealth, refinement, and order, you know there's another reality humming just below the varnish. Tonight, you're going to walk those halls and peer behind doors most visitors never saw. And brace yourself, because if you had been born in this time, on this land, you probably wouldn't survive the contradictions for long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always love seeing those time zone check-ins. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander deeper into the big house, every footstep muffled on expensive rugs shipped in from Europe, each one bought with profits wrung from cotton, sugar, or tobacco. The stillness has a weight to it, like the walls themselves are holding secrets. Visitors at the time often described these houses as warm, lively places full of genteel hospitality. But if you listen more closely, you'll notice a strange hush in the spaces between rooms. That hush wasn't accidental, it was cultivated. Plantation families were masters of presenting one face to the world and hiding another behind heavy curtains. On the surface, everything screamed refinement: imported china for tea, family Bibles on display, bristling with carefully inked genealogies, daughters practicing piano scales until their fingers ached. Guests might admire a tableau of happy family life, but you, standing here centuries later, know those oil portraits only told half the truth. Behind every brushstroke was a silence so loud it could shatter glass. One mainstream fact historians agree on: these plantations were deliberately constructed as stages. From the manicured lawns to the precise placement of rocking chairs on verandas, everything was designed to broadcast respectability. But here's the quirky part. Many of those mansions had small back staircases, narrow enough that you'd bump your shoulders if you weren't careful. Those weren't just shortcuts, they were escape routes, meant so enslaved servants could slip in and out unseen. You can almost hear the creak of a hidden door, a reminder that what looked like polished harmony depended on invisible labor and carefully hidden movements. And within those walls, the master's family wasn't as neatly divided as the portraits claimed. Slave owners often had what came to be called shadow families, children fathered with enslaved women, children who were never supposed to exist in polite society. Some lived in the very same house, sometimes even serving food at the same table as their half-siblings. Imagine the tension of that scene. A teenage boy passing biscuits to another boy who shared the same father, but whose existence was denied in every family record book. Historians still argue whether these shadow families were exceptions whispered about in scandal, or whether they were a widespread, nearly universal reality of slaveholding life. The walls themselves seem to lean in as you think about it. Those candle-lit parlors weren't just places for gossip and card games, they were theaters of denial. Masters shook hands with neighbors, wives poured tea with forced smiles, children giggled at the piano, all while enslaved women, some of them carrying the master's children, stood silently in the corners. It's the kind of double life that would fry your nerves if you had to keep it up today. And yet, for many planters, it was simply normal. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear it: the faint rustle of skirts, the clink of silverware, the echo of a door opening down a hidden hall. The plantation house was never quiet. It was layered with sound. Dogs barking outside, someone chopping wood by the kitchens, children laughing upstairs, and beneath it all, whispers. Whispers in the big house, whispers that carried truths no one dared speak aloud. You drift a little further, past the gleaming parlor where family heirlooms sit as if frozen in time, and toward the quieter corners of the house. Behind the bright front rooms where guests were entertained, whole lives unfolded in shadow. You trace your hand along a wall where the paint is just a shade different. It's a patch where a doorway once led, to a smaller hall. Those back passages hidden in plain sight tell you more than any gilded mirror or velvet curtain ever could. They carried the silent traffic of people who lived here but were never meant to be truly seen. The rhythm of daily life for the master's household looked outwardly serene. Breakfast served on time, letters written and sealed, children tutored in their Latin declensions. But what you see now as you hover in those spaces is how every act of order depended on a scaffolding of secrets. Slaveholders cultivated appearances the way gardeners cultivated hedges, meticulously trimmed, no stray branch allowed. One historical fact you can't ignore: enslaved women were present in nearly every corner of these households. They rocked babies, scrubbed sheets, carried firewood, stirred soup. Their labor was visible. But their forced intimacy with the master was invisible, at least in official conversations. That's the part swept behind the curtains. You might imagine a guest at dinner praising the plantation's hospitality, never guessing that the young woman refilling their glass of wine might also be the master's unacknowledged partner, or even the mother of his child. And here's the strange, almost quirky tidbit. Some visitors did notice. Travellers sometimes recorded subtle comments in their journals. A passing remark, like the resemblance between servant and master, was striking, scribbled in cramped handwriting, left as an aside in otherwise dull notes about crop yields and weather. These fragments survive, small clues that the facade was never airtight. The truth seeped through cracks if you looked carefully. Imagine now the mistress of the house arranging flowers for the parlour table. She's smiling for her children, but inside she knows. Many wives of slaveholders lived in a strange performance of denial. They knew about the other families. How could they not? Bedrooms were close. Whispers travelled faster than footsteps. But the rules of society demanded that wives endure quietly, preserving the family's outward dignity. Historians still argue whether mistresses of these houses wielded subtle power by controlling social appearances, or whether they were trapped as much as the women enslaved under their roofs, bound by expectations that demanded silence in the face of betrayal. At dinner, the weight of that silence filled the air as tangibly as the smell of roasted pork. Conversations turned to crops, politics, or the weather, never to the real topic, gnawing beneath the surface. You picture a teenage girl in her Sunday dress, chatting with her father about his political speeches, while her half-brother, born of her father's violence against an enslaved woman, stands in the corner, pouring her water. The air grows heavy in your chest just imagining it. The big house looked alive with laughter and ceremony, but you sense now the endless balancing act of hiding and pretending. You can almost hear a clock ticking in the hallway, measuring not just time, but tension. Every tick reminded families of what had to be kept unsaid. And if you lean closer, you might even catch the hush of someone slipping through a side door, carrying the truth like a shadow that always followed but never showed itself in daylight. You leave the parlour and follow that faint, ticking clock into the narrower passages of the house, where the polished sheen gives way to worn floorboards and scuffed plaster. Here, the air smells different. Less perfume and polished wood, more smoke, sweat, and starch from the kitchens. You step toward a back doorway that opens onto a path leading away from the big house itself, a path trodden daily by feet that history too often forgot. The slave quarters. They weren't far, never as distant as the planters liked to pretend. Sometimes just 100 steps from the main porch, sometimes close enough that the cries of a baby or the hum of a lullaby carried through the night air, right into the ears of the master's legitimate children. You imagine lying in bed as a white son or daughter of the house, listening through an open window and realizing, though never aloud, that the singing voice belonged to your half-sibling's mother. A solid historical fact is that enslaved quarters varied widely in construction. Some were rough log cabins with dirt floors, others were slightly sturdier wooden huts with brick chimneys. Archaeological digs reveal leftover shards of pottery, fish bones and beads, small fragments of life pieced together like puzzles. What makes your skin prickle is knowing that within those small rooms, entire worlds of feeling unfolded, joy, grief, forced intimacy, and often the presence of children who were the master's secret offspring. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some quarters had deliberate sight lines toward the big house. It wasn't just architecture, it was surveillance. Masters could glance from their parlor window and see smoke curling from chimneys or shadows moving at dusk. You can almost picture a plantation owner sipping brandy, pretending to gaze at the stars, but actually checking who lingered too long at another cabin's doorway. Inside those cabins, shadow families took shape. Children born into slavery but sharing the master's blood grew up in a liminal space, not quite invisible, not quite acknowledged. They played outside, their features sometimes betraying lineage even as society denied it. A boy with the master's eyes, a girl with the curve of his smile. Enslaved communities noticed, white families noticed. Silence became the most brittle currency of all. Imagine the tension in those moments when the big house and the quarters collided. Perhaps a child from the quarters was called up to bring water into the dining room. Standing there, within arm's reach of his father, while the father's legitimate children sat unaware, or maybe too aware, avoiding his gaze. Historians still argue whether enslaved communities considered these children a bridge between worlds, or a painful reminder of coercion. Some oral histories describe them as both, living contradictions of survival and exploitation. As you drift between the cabins and the mansion, the line blurs. The spaces were close enough to hear one another, yet the social gulf was immeasurable. You can almost feel the crunch of gravel underfoot as you walk the path, caught between two worlds that existed side by side but were never meant to touch. The plantation was a place of layers of distance and closeness, denial and recognition, shadows cast by the big house itself. You step into one of those dim cabins now, its walls low and close, the roof patched with whatever scraps could be found. The fire pit glows faintly, sending curls of smoke through a rough chimney. Around you, children sit cross-legged on the packed dirt floor, some playing with bits of broken crockery as toys, others staring quietly, their wide eyes reflecting the flicker of the flames. And here, in the circle of light, you see them, the children of the shadows. They are the living evidence of what the big house would never admit. Their faces carry the echoes of the master's features, skin tones lighter than some, a resemblance in the jawline or the eyes that was impossible to ignore. Plantation visitors sometimes mentioned the striking likeness between enslaved children and their masters, though such observations were often scribbled in margins or whispered privately. It was too dangerous, too destabilizing, to bring that resemblance into the open. One undeniable historical fact: these children were born enslaved because the law followed the status of the mother, not the father. If the mother was enslaved, so was the child, no matter whose blood flowed in their veins. This rule, deliberately written into colonial slave codes, ensured that the system replenished itself, generation after generation. Even a master's own child, if born to an enslaved woman, was legally his property, a child and a possession both at once. And here's the strange, almost absurd tidbit. Some of these children were given small privileges. A master might let them work indoors instead of in the fields, or teach them to read secretly, even while insisting they were not his kin. You can almost hear the hollow rationalizations. "It's just kindness, way," he'd say, while turning his face away from the obvious truth. The tension was unbearable at times. Imagine being one of the master's legitimate sons or daughters, staring across the yard at another child who looked startlingly like you, yet whom society demanded you treat as lesser. Did resentment flare? Did pity sneak in? Historians still argue whether white children on plantations embraced these half-siblings privately or recoiled from them as reminders of scandal. The records don't agree. Some letters hint at affection, others at bitter denial. And for the shadow children themselves, every day was a maze of contradictions. They might be called house servants instead of field hands, but that small shift couldn't erase the fact that their father dined in candlelit halls while they slept on hard planks. Some grew up never hearing him claim them. Others heard whispers from their mothers late at night, explaining carefully, painfully, why their faces looked like the ones in the parlor portraits. You lean against the rough wall now, hearing those whispers as if they still linger. The mother's voice, low and steady, carrying both comfort and warning. You belong here with me, but you also belong to him, and that's a dangerous truth to carry. Outside, crickets sing. Inside, the fire crackles. And in the flickering light, the children's shadows stretch long across the cabin floor, overlapping, merging, as if the walls themselves couldn't separate the lives that blood had already joined. You step back toward the main house now, through the heavy front doors where chandeliers glitter again, their glow falling across wide dining tables polished to a shine. The mistress of the house is here, arranging silverware with practiced grace, her movements precise enough to look like muscle memory. Her posture is upright, her hair pinned in place, her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. But you can feel it, the storm swirling just beneath that composed exterior. Every plantation wife lived with an open secret. She knew, everyone knew. The enslaved women in the house weren't just servants. Some carried the faces of betrayal in their children's eyes. And yet, for the sake of reputation, wealth, and her own survival, in a society that offered her few alternatives, the mistress maintained the charade. She presided over tea parties embroidered by lamplight, wrote polite letters to distant cousins, and smiled at Sunday church, all while swallowing humiliation that must have burned in her chest like hot coals. One mainstream historical fact: women of the planter class were expected to be the moral anchors of their families. Manuals on domestic virtues circulated widely, lecturing wives on patience, obedience, and the sacred duty of managing households. A wife who broke decorum, who confronted her husband publicly, risked her own standing. Silence wasn't just preferred, it was demanded. And yet here's the twisted tidbit. Many mistresses took out their rage, not on their husbands, but on the enslaved women, forced into those relationships. Diaries and letters record incidents where mistresses sold or punished the very women who bore their husbands' children. It was misdirected fury, a coping mechanism born of a world where confronting the man in power could destroy you faster than confronting someone enslaved. You can almost picture it: a quiet conversation in a bedroom, a husband's smirk of dismissal, followed by a mistress's decision to send a girl downriver, where she would vanish from sight forever. Still, the silence at the dinner table was suffocating. You can hear it: the clatter of forks, the polite chatter about weather or crops, the scratch of cutlery against porcelain. But underneath, everyone feels it. The mistress glances at the servant pouring her wine, noting her husband's eyes in that girl's face. The legitimate children glance at one another, sensing tension they're not supposed to name. The husband clears his throat, his words carefully neutral. You shift in your chair, uncomfortable, aware that the entire meal is a performance balancing on the edge of denial. Historians still argue whether these women had real power or lived only as hostages of the system. Some point to mistresses who controlled household finances, who shaped the lives of enslaved people with an iron hand. Others insist that their fury, their silence, and their punishments all reflected the narrow prison of gender roles in which they were trapped. Either way, their lives were marked by contradictions as sharp as the silver knives they laid out for supper. And so you stand here, feeling the weight of her unspoken words. Her face remains calm, but her eyes flicker just for a second toward the back door where enslaved women pass in and out. It's in that flicker that the whole truth lies, an acknowledgement, a fury, a grief she cannot voice. The mistress knows, she always knew. You stay in that dining room, the long table stretching like a stage, its polished surface reflecting candlelight. Platters of roasted meat arrive, bowls of stewed vegetables, fresh bread still steaming from the kitchen ovens. At first glance it feels almost festive, until you notice the silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of avoidance, carefully orchestrated like a symphony where one instrument is deliberately missing. The conversation circles harmless topics, Someone mentions the weather, how the rains might affect the cotton. Another asks about a neighbor's health or a cousin's new baby. But the air feels heavy, each voice weighted with what isn't being said, because standing only a few feet away, refilling cups, handing out napkins, are children and women whose very existence unsettles the family order. Shadow children serving legitimate heirs, half-siblings avoiding one another's eyes while sharing the same table. One historical fact to ground you here: visitors often remarked on the quietness of southern dining rooms. Unlike the bustling, noisy meals of northern households, plantation dinners had an almost formal hush. Etiquette guides advised restraint, dignity, measured speech. But within that stillness, truths rattled silently like loose coins in a pocket. You can feel the unease pressing at your temples. And the quirky tidbit? Sometimes those same dinners featured enslaved musicians providing background music. Violins, flutes, or even improvised instruments filled the air with sound, softening the silence but never erasing it. Imagine that, a boy who was both enslaved and the master's son playing violin at the table while his father passed biscuits to his legitimate children. The notes floating into the rafters, carrying contradictions no polite guest dared mention. The mistress's fork scrapes against her plate. A son clears his throat. A daughter glances at the servant whose face resembles her own. Everyone knows. No one speaks. Historians still argue whether white children acknowledged those half-siblings privately, perhaps in stolen moments of compassion, or whether they learned quickly to mirror their parents' silence. Letters and diaries suggest both happened, depending on the household. The silence, though, was always the rule in public. The food cools, the candles gutter, the conversation limps forward, never daring to trip into honesty. And through it all, the servants continue their quiet choreography, moving dishes, pouring wine, sweeping crumbs from the tablecloth. You can almost hear the creak of their shoes against the floorboards, the soft brush of fabric against polished wood. These small sounds fill the space left empty by truths that could never be voiced aloud. You lean back in your chair, feeling the weight of that silence sink into your own chest. The big house wasn't just a place of wealth. It was a place of repression, where every meal became a performance of denial. And though the table might be cleared, the silence lingered, hanging in the air like smoke long after the candles were snuffed out. You wander from that suffocating dining room into the quiet halls upstairs, where candle flames flicker against portraits in heavy gilt frames. The painted faces look down at you with unblinking eyes, proud and dignified, as though the people in them never lied, never wavered, never carried double lives. But you know better. Those walls had seen too much. It is in these private chambers where the lines between intimacy and coercion blur. Enslaved women were not partners by choice. They lived under constant threat. A master's relationship was not really a relationship at all. It was power dressed up in the flimsiest of disguises. The law, the whip, the chains, the threat of sale, they all loomed behind every whispered word, every touch. You can almost feel the weight of that imbalance pressing in on these narrow rooms, making the air thick, almost unbearable. A historical fact worth stating clearly: in almost every slave-holding society, sexual violence was endemic. It wasn't just a matter of a few men behaving badly. It was built into the very structure of slavery. Ownership meant access, in every sense. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse, no recourse to protect themselves. And when children were born of those encounters, the law neatly folded them back into the system as property. And here's a strange, almost fringe tidbit. Some planters boasted privately about fathering many children among the enslaved. Letters survive where men bragged as if their abuses proved their virility. In modern terms, it's the kind of grotesque chest-thumping that would earn someone a permanent spot on the internet's worst people alive list. Yet in their world, it was treated as evidence of manhood, not shame. Think of the enslaved women themselves, though. Some resisted with quiet strategies, refusing certain foods to avoid pregnancies, feigning illness, or trying to redirect attention toward other tasks. Others endured in silence, calculating survival, not just for themselves but for their children. Historians still argue whether those small acts of resistance carried real weight, but to the women who attempted them, they were lifelines. Imagine lying awake in one of those upper rooms, hearing footsteps in the hallway. You know who they belong to. The door creaks open, the candle guttering. You feel the dread in your chest, the sense that your body is not your own. And down the hall, the mistress lies awake too, staring at her ceiling, knowing exactly where her husband has gone. The house is full of breathing, full of shifting bodies, full of lives colliding in silence. You trace your hand along the smooth banister now, aware that it was polished not just by house servants, but by the countless hands of women who had walked these halls, carrying secrets no one was supposed to name. The shadows in this house were not just cast by candlelight. They were families, forced into existence by coercion, living proof of a system built on both labor and silence. You step out of those private chambers and move toward a side staircase, the kind tucked away in the corner of the house. The boards creak differently here, less polished, less often trodden by the family, more by the people who kept the machinery of the household running. At the bottom, you find yourself in the domain of the overseer, not in the big house itself, but close enough that his presence was always felt. The overseer wasn't just about managing fields and punishing runaways. His shadow reached into every part of plantation life, even the most intimate corners. Sometimes he acted as a gatekeeper for the master's access to enslaved women, controlling schedules, movements, and punishments. Other times he took advantage of his own position, exploiting those same women under the thin shield of authority. The power was never far away. It seeped into every interaction, every word spoken between overseer and enslaved person. A historical fact that often shocks modern ears. Many overseers were young, unmarried men hired from poorer white families. They were given enormous control not only over labor, but also over human lives. Their reputations varied. Some were known as brutal disciplinarians, others as opportunistic predators. In either case, their authority could shape who lived, who suffered, and who carried the secret weight of another child. And the quirky tidbit? Overseers often lived in modest cabins near the quarters rather than the big house. That meant they were physically closer to enslaved families than to the master's family. Their proximity bred suspicion. Enslaved people sometimes whispered that a baby with pale eyes or a certain jawline didn't belong to the master at all, but to the overseer. Plantation gossip had layers upon layers, and those layers never made it into the official ledgers. Historians still argue whether overseers acted independently or whether masters deliberately turned a blind eye to their abuses, preferring to keep plausible deniability. The truth likely varied, but either way, enslaved women carried the consequences. Imagine being trapped between the master's demands on one side and the overseer's threats on the other, with no space left for dignity or refusal. You glance around this small, plain room where the overseer kept his ledgers, pages filled with neat rows of numbers, bushels of cotton, hours of labor, days of punishment. But hidden behind those tidy figures were untidy realities, children born, stories silenced, women coerced. The ledger shows order, the room whispers chaos. As you step back toward the main path, you can almost hear the voices, one barking commands at dawn, another whispering apologies at dusk. The overseer was never far away, and his presence reminds you that the shadow families were not formed only in the master's chambers. They were woven into the fabric of plantation life, sustained by a system that gave power to men at every rung of the ladder and left enslaved women without escape. You step out into the plantation yard now, the evening sky painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun sinks low. A church bell echoes faintly in the distance, one of those small, whitewashed chapels where slaveholding families gathered on Sundays. The sound floats across the fields, solemn and self-righteous, a call to virtue that feels oddly hollow when you remember what was happening inside the big house at night. Religion was the glue that many planters used to justify their world. They recited Bible verses about obedience, spoke of divine order, and reminded enslaved people that servants obey your masters was printed right there in holy text. On Sunday mornings you can almost see the master striding proudly into the front pew, his wife trailing behind with her Bible, children neatly dressed, each face a portrait of piety. One undeniable historical fact: churches in the South often reinforced slavery. Ministers preached that bondage was part of God's plan, that discipline was righteous, and that morality could be compartmentalized. But while the sermons urged fidelity and virtue, the reality back at the plantation was another story entirely. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some masters brought enslaved women to church and made them sit in separate balconies or outside under trees. Imagine the hypocrisy, listening to a preacher thunder about sin while staring directly at a woman you had coerced into your bed, and then, after the service, walking back to the house with your wife on one side and that same woman trailing behind with the children in tow. Historians still argue whether these men genuinely believed their religious justifications or whether it was all theatre, a performance for society and for themselves. Did they feel guilt, or did they really think God had signed off on their double lives? The debate lingers because evidence is contradictory. Some letters reveal agonized conscience, while others read like smug sermons written by men blind to their own hypocrisy. You stand at the chapel door now, the wooden pews smelling faintly of pine and candle wax. A hymn floats in your imagination, voices rising in harmony. The wives sing with trembling devotion, the children fidget, and the masters close their eyes as if soaking in righteousness. But all the while, unspoken truths sit in the back row like unwelcome guests. Step back outside and the fields stretch endlessly, the big house looming in the distance. The church bell fades, but the silence that replaces it feels louder than any sermon. It reminds you that morality here was a costume, worn proudly on Sundays, folded away by Monday, and ignored entirely when night fell. You wander back toward the house, the night settling heavy over the fields, the crickets singing their endless chorus. The big house glows faintly with lamplight, its windows like eyes that refuse to blink. Inside you catch sight of a young boy leaning over a book, mouthing words under his breath. His clothes are finer than most, but his skin is not as pale as the portraits hanging on the wall. You realize you're looking at one of the shadow children, navigating a world that half acknowledges him and half denies him. Some of these children were given privileges, small scraps of recognition that set them apart from the others in the quarters. A master might grant them lighter duties, let them serve in the house rather than the fields, or, on rare occasions, offer them the gift of education. A historical fact that survives in plantation records: a few mixed-race children fathered by owners were secretly taught to read and write, even though literacy for enslaved people was illegal in most states. It was dangerous for both teacher and student, but the lessons happened, sometimes in the glow of candlelight, sometimes in hurried whispers behind closed doors. Here's the quirky part. A handful of these children were even sent north to attend schools, presented as wards or servants of the family. Neighbors may have raised an eyebrow, but money and influence smoothed over questions. Imagine the strange double life of those boys and girls, treated as favorites by their fathers, but still enslaved by law, growing up with the knowledge that their futures hung by a thread of convenience. You can almost see the tension at play. The boy bends over his book, practicing his letters, while the mistress of the house watches from the doorway. Does she allow it because it placates her husband? Or does she grit her teeth, each word he spells cutting like glass? Historians still argue whether these gestures of favour were acts of guilt, moments of paternal affection, or simply pragmatic investments in useful household servants. The truth is probably all three, shifting like candlelight on a wall. For the child himself, though, the world was a labyrinth. He might carry his father's name in whispers, never on paper. He might hear people call him boy when he knew he was blood. And each time he looked at the family Bible in the parlour, filled with names and dates, he knew there was no space for him. Step closer now, and you can hear the scratch of his pencil, the soft murmur of his voice as he repeats a word. His shadow stretches across the desk, long and thin, merging into the darker corners of the room. It feels symbolic somehow, half in the light, half swallowed by the dark. That was the reality of shadow children, suspended between belonging and rejection, written in flesh but erased in ink. You drift further into the house, where the flicker of lamplight falls on shelves stacked with ledgers, journals, and neatly folded papers. The smell of ink and old parchment lingers, faint but distinct, as though the room itself remembers every number scratched into those pages. Plantation owners prided themselves on record-keeping. Cotton bales, hogsheads of sugar, lists of enslaved people, all carefully documented. But sometimes, if you look close, those ledgers whisper secrets they were never meant to tell. A solid historical fact. Plantation inventories routinely listed enslaved people by name, age, and monetary value, the way one might list cattle or furniture. Tidy columns reduced human lives to assets on a balance sheet. And yet, tucked in the margins, historians occasionally find odd notations, an extra allowance for a boy working in the house, a peculiar surname added where none should exist, or a child listed with the word mulatto in cramped handwriting. These subtle entries sometimes betrayed what polite society worked hard to deny: the existence of shadow families. Here's the quirky tidbit. In a few ledgers, masters wrote small stars or symbols next to certain names, a kind of private code. Scholars still debate what those symbols meant, but some suggest they marked children fathered by the owner. Imagine the cold absurdity of it. Your lineage reduced to a star in the margin, your humanity accounted for in ink, but never acknowledged at the dinner table. The mistress might stumble upon these records, flipping pages while her husband was away. Did she linger on the familiar features described beside a servant's name? Did her stomach turn as she realized her household's books doubled as confessions? Historians still argue whether wives confronted their husbands with this evidence, or whether the books were quietly closed, their silence preserved in the same neat cursive that disguised scandal as routine. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill as the master sits at his desk late at night, tallying bushels harvested alongside the births of children who bore his blood. The fire crackles in the hearth, casting shadows on the wall, while he writes down in measured strokes the truths he'd never speak aloud. Outside, the quarters hum with nighttime songs. Inside, the ledgers grow heavy with contradiction. It's unsettling, isn't it? Numbers and names arranged in straight lines, pretending to be objective, while underneath lies the messiness of lives intertwined by coercion, betrayal, and denial. The ledger offers a mask of order, but the ink stains reveal more than the writer ever intended. And as you run your finger along the edge of the page, you feel the chill of knowing that even silence leaves a paper trail. You step away from the ledger room, following the faint smell of tobacco and lamp oil into a hall where framed legal documents hang on the walls like trophies. Contracts, deeds, and land grants, all the paper armor of a planter's world. But in those crisp black letters lies a truth sharper than any blade. The law itself built the scaffolding that allowed shadow families to exist without ever being named. One immovable historical fact: colonial and antebellum slave codes decreed that the status of a child followed the condition of the mother. Enslaved mother meant enslaved child, no exceptions, no appeals. This law, called partus sequitur ventrum, ensured that even if a child carried the master's blood, he carried the mother's chains. It was legal brilliance for the planters and legal erasure for the children. The law didn't just ignore shadow families, it erased them in advance. Here's the quirky detail. Courts occasionally had to wrestle with bizarre inheritance cases. Imagine a master dying, leaving behind legitimate heirs in the parlor and illegitimate children in the quarters. Sometimes a lawyer would notice resemblances too obvious to ignore. Records survive of disputes where mulatto children were quietly acknowledged, not in wills, but in side notes or last-minute provisions. Yet even then the law bent only so far. The children were usually given small gifts or manumission at best, never equal inheritance. And the cruelest twist? White society pretended these families didn't exist, but the law quietly made space for their denial. By writing rules that turned every shadow child into property, lawmakers created a system where fathers could sell their own sons without breaking a single statute. You can almost hear the shuffle of papers in a courtroom, the murmur of lawyers, the gavels striking wood, order imposed on chaos, silence enshrined in law. Historians still argue whether these codes were designed purely for economic efficiency or whether they were a deliberate moral shield, allowing masters to indulge in abuse while telling themselves the law made it legitimate. Either way, the result was the same. Entire generations of mixed-race children lived and died unacknowledged, even as their fathers sat in legislatures writing new laws. Picture the mistress standing stiffly in the back of such a courtroom, her face unreadable as legal jargon swirled around her. Picture the enslaved mother clutching her child's hand, knowing the verdict was already written in the very fabric of the law. And then picture the master himself adjusting his coat, proud of his property holdings, unmoved by the fact that the ledger of assets now included his own children. The law was not blind here. It looked straight at the problem and chose denial. Each clause, each statute was a curtain pulled tight over truths everyone could see. And as you drift through this hallway lined with framed documents, you realize they aren't just ink on paper. They're monuments to silence, chiseled as carefully as any statue. You step back into the parlor where the mistress sits, her embroidery hoop in hand, the needle flashing in and out of cloth like a tiny sword. Her posture is elegant, her voice calm as she gives instructions to the children or asks after the household staff. But you notice her eyes, sharp, restless, always darting toward the door where enslaved women pass with trays or linens. That gaze carries something heavy, not just suspicion but simmering rage. The wives of slaveholders lived in a paradox. They were expected to embody virtue, patience, and dignity, yet their lives were filled with humiliation that society demanded they ignore. When that humiliation became unbearable, their fury often fell not on their husbands, but on the women enslaved under their roofs. It was easier, safer to lash out at those who could not fight back. A firm historical fact: letters and diaries reveal mistresses selling off enslaved women who bore their husbands' children. Some arranged for them to be sent downriver, a phrase that in the antebellum South meant exile to harsher plantations, often in Louisiana or Mississippi. The punishment wasn't directed at the men who fathered those children. It was directed at the women forced into the situation. And the odd, bitter tidbit? Some mistresses staged elaborate acts of denial. One might insist that a baby clearly looked like one of the field hands, dismissing the resemblance to her husband as coincidence. Another might pretend not to notice at all, but then quietly banish the mother from the big house. It was theatre, performed daily, with devastating consequences for the women involved. Historians still argue whether mistresses gained a form of power through these acts, exerting control where they could, or whether their retaliation only underscored how powerless they truly felt against their husbands' betrayals. Either way, the scars fell on enslaved women and their children, not on the men who caused the rift. You imagine now the mistress's needle slipping, pricking her finger, a tiny bead of blood staining the fabric. She curses under her breath, then glares at the young woman entering with fresh linens, a girl who carries in her features the undeniable mark of the master. The air between them crackles, heavy with everything unspoken. One woman trapped in a gilded cage of respectability, the other trapped in chains of law and violence. Neither free, though only one called a slave. The mistress resumes her stitching, her lips pressed tight. She cannot confront her husband, not without risking her own stability, but she can make decisions about the women in her household. And so she does. Quiet punishments, sudden sales, cruel dismissals. It's an ugly mirror, power turned sideways, never upward. You glance once more at her embroidery hoop, the red thread winding through the fabric. From a distance it looks delicate, refined. Up close it's full of knots, tangles and snags hidden on the backside. Just like the household she ruled, perfect from afar, unravelling when you dare to look too close. Step outside for a moment. into the humid evening where the cicadas sing and lantern light flickers faintly from the quarters. The night carries whispers, quiet voices drifting across the yard, half-muffled laughter, a baby's cry. This was how news travelled, not through letters or ledgers, but through word of mouth, passed from one cabin to another like a living current. And among those whispers, shadow families were an open secret. Enslaved communities noticed everything. They saw which children carried the master's eyes, which young women were called into the big house after dark, which babies were suddenly given slightly better food or clothing. The enslaved weren't blind to the patterns, they lived inside them. In hushed tones by the fire, or while gathering water from a well, they traded stories. That boy, he's the master's son. That girl, she's kin, though no one will say it. A grounded historical fact. Oral tradition was a powerful force in enslaved life. In the absence of written records, stories preserved lineages, betrayals, and truths that paper tried to erase. Many descendants today trace their ancestry not from official documents, which often omit or deny shadow families, but from whispered names handed down for generations. And the quirky tidbit? Gossip sometimes crossed the colour line. Letters survived from white visitors remarking on peculiar resemblances or on stories the servants tell. Even outsiders who spent only a short time on a plantation sometimes left with more than a hint of its secrets. Rumours were like smoke. You could try to wave them away, but they lingered, seeping into clothes, clinging to skin. Historians still argue whether these whispers offered a form of resistance. By naming the unspoken, did enslaved people reclaim a fragment of power? Some scholars say yes, that acknowledging truth, even privately, was a way to puncture the master's carefully curated facade. Others say the whispers were survival tools, warnings passed along so that mothers could protect their daughters from the master's gaze. You close your eyes and hear it now. A group of women gathered outside a cabin, their voices low but steady. They're not just sharing gossip, they're keeping each other alive with information. They warn of patterns, of dangers, of favoritism that might cut one way or another. The truth moves like a breeze, soft but unstoppable, carrying knowledge even when the big house tries to lock it behind closed doors. In the distance, the master sleeps in his bed. The mistress lies awake, staring at the ceiling. But outside, beneath the vast southern sky, the enslaved weave their truths into the night air. Rumours on the breeze, stories too fragile to be written, yet too strong to ever be silenced. You drift toward the edge of the quarters now, where a group of children chase one another in the dust, their laughter rising into the warm night. You pause and listen closely. When one is called back by a mother's voice, the name spoken carries weight, not just sound, because in a world built on denial, names were a battleground of truth, a solid historical fact. Enslaved people were often stripped of surnames in official records, reduced to first names only, or worse, to labels like boy, girl, or mulatto. Surnames, when granted, were inconsistent, sometimes tied to the master's family, sometimes to occupations, sometimes erased entirely. This stripping away of lineage wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate method of control, denying people the anchors of ancestry and identity. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some masters quietly gave their shadow children surnames that hinted at kinship without saying it outright. A boy might suddenly bear the same last name as a distant cousin. A girl might be called by a name echoing the master's mother's maiden name. To outsiders, it looked like coincidence. To those who knew, it was a crooked acknowledgement, half secret, half mockery. For the children themselves, names could be both protection and burden. Imagine being told, you're not to use that name outside this house. Imagine having two names, the one whispered by your mother in the quarters, and the one barked by the overseer in the fields. Which one was real? Which one would last? Historians still argue whether enslaved families used naming as an act of resistance, planting hidden genealogies that only insiders could trace. Some believe the choice of certain names, biblical ones, or the recycled names of grandparents, was a way of asserting continuity even when the law tried to erase it. You can almost see it now, a boy standing straighter when his mother calls him by the name his father denies, or a girl whispering her true name to a younger sibling so it won't be forgotten. In the stillness of the night, these names carry like lanterns, flickering, fragile, but fiercely alive. The big house might record "child of no surname" in its ledgers, but the quarters remembered. They remembered who belonged to whom, who carried the master's blood, who was connected by invisible threads of kinship. And long after the ink on plantation books faded, those names continued in stories, in whispers, in the pride of descendants who refused to let them die. You step back from the children's laughter, letting their voices echo in your ears. Each name called into the night feels like a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that even in a world of chains, identity was never fully erased. The weight of names lingered, sometimes denied, sometimes twisted, but never entirely lost. The night deepens as you step into the glow of a lantern hanging by the kitchen door. A group of women sit together on low stools, their faces tired but watchful, their children clustered nearby. And in the flicker of light, you notice something undeniable: differences in skin tone. Some children are as dark as their mothers, others lighter, their features betraying a mix of ancestry that no one dared say aloud. This was the hierarchy of color, a ladder invisible to outsiders, but felt acutely within enslaved communities. A grounded historical fact, the South practiced what scholars call colorism long before the term existed. Lighter-skinned enslaved people were more likely to be assigned to housework, trusted with tasks closer to the family, and sometimes even trained for skilled labor. Darker-skinned individuals were far more often sent to the fields. This wasn't kindness. It was a cruel, calculated system that pitted people against one another, using skin tone as yet another tool of control. And the quirky tidbit? Some slaveholders kept meticulous track of terms like quadroon or octoroon, mathematical labels for fractions of African ancestry. These bizarre classifications were treated almost like scientific fact, as though a person's worth could be divided neatly into eighths and sixteenths. You can imagine a pompous planter boasting at a dinner party about his refined house servant being only 1/8 black, while ignoring that the math itself revealed generations of exploitation. For the shadow children, this hierarchy carved out a painful, liminal place. They might be spared the whip of the fields, but their presence in the big house was a constant reminder of truths too dangerous to speak. Some gained small privileges, better clothes, a chance at literacy. Others found themselves targets of envy or suspicion, mistrusted both by the master's family and by fellow enslaved people, wary of favoritism. Historians still argue whether these lighter-skinned children represented a bridge between worlds, or whether they were deliberately used as wedges to fracture enslaved communities. You can almost feel the tension in the air around that kitchen door. The women exchange glances measuring fairness, muttering about favoritism. A darker-skinned boy rubs his arm and glares at a lighter-skinned child given an easier chore. And all the while, the master's shadow looms over them, having created these divisions and then stepped back, watching them play out. You tilt your head up and see the stars, the same ones that generations of enslaved people gazed at in searching for direction and for meaning. The constellations didn't care about fractions of ancestry or hierarchies of skin, but down here, under the rule of the big house, those arbitrary divisions shaped every life, in whispers, in sideways glances, in who carried water and who carried trays. The weight of skin color built another invisible wall inside an already broken world. You wander toward a smaller room off the side of the big house, where a single candle glows faintly on a wooden table. A young girl sits hunched over, her lips moving silently as she traces letters on a scrap of paper. Her hands tremble, but her eyes burn with concentration. She is one of the master's shadow children, and tonight she is learning to read in secret. A historical fact, literacy for enslaved people was outlawed across much of the South. After uprisings like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, laws became even stricter. Teaching an enslaved person to read could result in heavy fines, public shaming, even imprisonment. For the enslaved themselves, the punishment could be far worse. And yet education happened, quietly, dangerously, hidden in the corners of kitchens or in the dim glow of candlelight. And here's the curious tidbit. Some masters secretly taught their own shadow children letters and numbers, bending the law while pretending publicly to uphold it. Others left the task to their legitimate children, turning reading lessons into a twisted family pastime. Imagine a white son chuckling as he taught his enslaved half-brother the alphabet, never admitting the blood they shared. Education, in these cases, was both a gift and a weapon. The girl at the table tonight whispers the word free under her breath, her voice almost inaudible. Her mother hovers nearby, heart racing at every creak of the floorboards. If the mistress of the house discovered them, punishment would be swift and merciless. But still the lesson continues. The risk is worth it, because knowledge is a spark that cannot be easily snuffed out. Historians still argue whether these small acts of teaching were motivated by guilt, affection, or pragmatism. Was the master easing his conscience by educating a child he refused to name? Or was he simply preparing a servant to manage household accounts more efficiently? Either way, the result was the same. A new generation of shadow children learned to navigate both the world of the quarters and the world of books, gaining a dangerous kind of power. You can almost hear the scratch of the quill, the faint sound of a page turning, the sharp intake of breath, each time a new word clicks into place. Outside, the crickets sing. Inside, the girl repeats the letters, her voice trembling but steady. A, B, C. Every syllable is rebellion. Every whispered word is survival. The candle burns lower, its flame flickering against the wall, casting shadows of letters onto the plaster. To you, they look like ghosts, ghosts of futures that might have been, of possibilities stolen but never fully destroyed. And as you watch her lean closer to the page, you realize this. Education was not just learning, it was a way to claim a fragment of dignity in a world built on denial. Step outside into the humid air again, following the sound of footsteps crunching against gravel paths. In the moonlight, you see a young woman walking briskly toward the edge of the quarters, her shoulders tense, her eyes darting at every shadow. She is not sneaking away for freedom tonight, though you can feel she dreams of it, but rather slipping out of reach, trying to avoid the master's gaze. This was another hidden story of the shadow families, escapes of the heart. Enslaved women were not passive victims, though the system tried to cast them that way. They resisted in quiet ways, sometimes by refusing advances, sometimes by finding love on their own terms, and sometimes by running, if not northward to freedom, then at least into the arms of someone who offered genuine affection. One solid historical fact. Resistance among enslaved women often took the form of subtle defiance, refusing to enter certain rooms, deliberately working slowly, even covering themselves in ways meant to make them less appealing. Court records and slave narratives reveal countless small acts of refusal, each one a gamble, each one carrying the risk of violent retaliation. And here's the strange, almost overlooked tidbit. Some women found ways to disguise themselves during harvest gatherings or Sunday visits, slipping off to meet men they loved, creating relationships that gave them strength, even under the eye of the overseer. Anthropologists have uncovered songs that may have doubled as coded love notes, melodies that sounded like work chants but carried hidden messages for those listening closely. Imagine humming a tune at dusk that told your sweetheart, "Meet me by the old oak tree," while everyone else thought you were just passing time. Historians still argue how widespread these escapes of the heart were. Some believe they were rare sparks of defiance in a system designed to stamp out hope. Others suggest they were essential to survival, that enslaved women carved out emotional sanctuaries wherever they could, even if only for fleeting moments. Picture now the young woman pausing at the tree line, her breath quick, her heart pounding. She meets the gaze of another enslaved man waiting there, his hand outstretched. For a moment, the weight of the master's control lifts. For a moment, she chooses. The world around them, the big house, the overseer, the endless rows of cotton fades into silence. In that silence, something almost like freedom exists. You linger in the shadows, listening as the crickets sing louder, covering their whispers. The stars blaze above, indifferent, eternal. And though you know dawn will bring its brutal return, you also know that for tonight, her heart escaped. Even in a world that claimed every part of her body and life, she seized something untouchable. You follow that young woman's footsteps back toward the cabins, but instead of stopping there, you drift northward in your imagination, carried by whispers and letters that traveled beyond the plantation. Not every story of shadow families stayed locked behind the big house walls. Some leaked out, like ink spreading across paper, reaching the ears and eyes of free communities far away. One historical fact: after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, more escaped enslaved people wrote or dictated narratives of their lives, often published in the North. These accounts sometimes contained startling revelations about masters' shadow families. Readers in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York who thought of slavery in abstract terms suddenly found themselves face to face with stories of men who preached morality while secretly fathering children they refused to acknowledge. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it made abolitionist newspapers practically hum with outrage. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some northern towns, neighbors would whisper when an escaped family arrived, noticing the striking resemblance between a fugitive child and a prominent southern politician whose speeches were reprinted in newspapers. It was gossip at a distance, fueled by letters, sermons, and abolitionist pamphlets. Imagine the scandal: a senator railing against abolition in Washington, while half his face stared back at him from a boy who had managed to flee to Canada. For the shadow families themselves, letters northward often carried desperate hopes. A mother might send word through the underground networks, asking if anyone had seen her child who'd been sold away. A half-sibling might write to abolitionist allies, trying to trace connections the law had erased. Historians still argue how often these letters succeeded, or whether most were lost in the chaos of war and distance. But even the attempt shows how determined people were to stitch their families back together, no matter how far they had been torn apart. You can almost picture it: a free black community in Philadelphia gathering at night, a fugitive father reading aloud a letter describing a girl on a Louisiana plantation, light-skinned, with her father's eyes. The listeners murmur, some nodding, some shaking their heads in grief. The news spreads, echoing across taverns and churches, carried on northern winds, just as whispers carried news on the plantations. You stand there in that imagined room, the candlelight flickering, the letter trembling in someone's hand. The master, hundreds of miles away, thinks his secret is safe, but the truth has already slipped out of his grasp. The ink on the page is proof enough. His shadow families could not be confined to ledgers and silence forever. They escaped not only with footsteps in the night, but with words on paper, reaching places where hypocrisy could no longer hide. You leave behind the northern parlors and abolitionist pamphlets, returning to the quieter, bureaucratic heartbeat of the South, the census books. Walk with me into a county clerk's office in 1850, where the air smells of ink and dust and shelves sag under the weight of ledgers. The clerk dips his pen, scratches names into columns, and without meaning to, leaves behind clues that would outlast the plantation itself. A firm historical fact: U.S. Census records from the antebellum period often listed enslaved people not by name but by age, sex, and color, mulatto being one of the most common categories. To the census taker, it was just a column to fill. To us, those check marks and labels are evidence of generations of shadow families. Whole pages show clusters of mulatto children living on plantations where the master's legitimate family had strikingly similar features. The pattern is too obvious to ignore. And here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes census takers slipped up. They might accidentally list an enslaved child with the master's surname, or add a cryptic note like "lives in house" instead of "in quarters." These slips are rare, but they're gold mines for genealogists today, tiny cracks in the wall of denial that reveal relationships nobody wanted to admit. Now picture the master himself leafing through those records years later. Maybe he smirks, thinking no one will ever piece together the truth. Maybe he convinces himself the bureaucratic language has erased the shame. But centuries later, descendants pore over those same pages, their fingers tracing the faint handwriting, their eyes widening at the sudden realization. The census doesn't lie, even when it tries to. Historians still argue how deliberate these notations were. Were census takers complicit in protecting masters' reputations, or were they quietly recording what they saw with a wink and a nudge? The debate lingers, but the results remain. Hidden evidence etched into government paperwork, waiting for someone patient enough to read between the lines. You lean over the clerk's shoulder in your imagination, watching as he dips the quill again. He writes, "Mulatto girl, age 10. He doesn't pause, doesn't wonder about the mother's face, the father's denial. To him, it's just another line in a book. But to you, standing here in the quiet office, the ink feels heavy, like a confession disguised as data. Step outside again, and the cicadas hum in the trees. The big house looms in the distance, smug and silent. Yet you know its secrets are already betrayed, not by scandalous rumors or tearful confrontations, but by the cold, steady hand of bureaucracy. The census books may look dull, but hidden in their lines is a chorus of voices whispering, "We were here. We existed. We could not be erased." You drift now into a world of handshakes and speeches, of polished boots clacking on marble floors. The plantation master who smirked through silent dinners also strode into town meetings and legislative halls, presenting himself as a guardian of morality. Many of these men were not only planters, they were politicians, lawyers, judges, and lawmakers. And as you stand in the echo of their chambers, you realize how far their duplicity reached. One historical fact: some of the loudest defenders of slavery in Congress and state assemblies were men who privately fathered mixed-race children. Their speeches thundered with righteous declarations about protecting the sanctity of white womanhood and the purity of Southern society. Meanwhile, just a carriage ride away, their shadow families lived in the quarters of their plantations, invisible but undeniable. And the quirky tidbit opponents sometimes knew. Abolitionist newspapers occasionally hinted at scandals, naming prominent men and slyly remarking on the peculiar composition of their households. Imagine reading a fiery editorial in Boston with a thinly veiled jab at a Southern senator whose half-black children had been spotted in town. The North laughed, the South raged, but the children themselves carried the weight of being pawns in a game of reputation. Historians still argue whether politics amplified this hypocrisy or simply gave it a larger stage. Did men in power double down on their morality speeches because they feared exposure? Or did they truly convince themselves that shadow families didn't count, that private abuses were neatly separated from public virtue? The debate remains unsettled, but the pattern is unmistakable. The higher the pedestal, the deeper the shadow cast behind it. You can almost hear it now, a booming voice in a crowded hall, railing against immorality, while his own son, enslaved by law, labors on the family plantation. The crowd applauds, hats wave in the air, the speaker bows. But somewhere in the audience, a traveller whispers to his neighbour, "Doesn't that boy on his farm look just like him?" The murmur fades quickly, smothered by cheers, but the truth has already slipped loose. Step into the quiet afterward, when the speeches are done. The politician retreats to his chambers, loosens his cravat and pours himself a drink. He thinks he has convinced the world. Yet on his desk lies a letter, unopened, from an abolitionist society threatening to expose him. The lamplight flickers, his hand trembles, but he never admits anything aloud. Public power demanded spotless virtue. Private reality left stains no speech could scrub clean. And so as you wander away from those echoing halls, the contradiction follows, like a shadow you can't shake. These men built reputations on righteousness while living lives that betrayed every word. The plantation wasn't just a farm, it was a stage, and politics was the performance that demanded louder and louder applause to drown out the whispers of truth. You drift back into the big house, this time into the parlour, where heavy curtains block the late afternoon sun. Oil portraits line the walls, rows of solemn faces in gilded frames, each painted to preserve an image of legitimacy. Sons posed with books or riding crops, daughters with lace gloves and delicate flowers. Every brushstroke polished the illusion of a perfect lineage. But you can feel it, the silence lurking in the corners where no portraits hang. A firm historical fact. Elite families spent large sums on portraiture to cement their status. Painters were instructed to highlight noble features, fine clothing, and inherited resemblance. These canvases served as public proof of purity and prosperity. But what they never showed were the other children, the ones with matching features who would never be invited to sit for a portrait. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some surviving paintings include enslaved attendants, usually children holding trays or pets. To the family, these figures were decorative props, symbols of wealth. Yet when you look closely, some of those painted faces bear striking similarities to the family they served. Art historians debate whether this was intentional or whether painters simply reproduced what they saw. Either way, the irony is chilling. The shadow families may have been immortalized on canvas, hidden in plain sight. You picture a visitor standing here, sipping tea, glancing between a painted heir on the wall and a servant in the room who shared the same eyes. Did they notice? Did they laugh about it later in private? Historians still argue whether society turned a blind eye out of politeness or out of willful complicity. The evidence suggests both. Everyone knew, no one spoke. Imagine the mistress of the house, forced to sit for her portrait while her husband stood proudly beside her. She holds a flower, a symbol of virtue. Yet she can't help but glance at the enslaved girl holding her train, a girl with her husband's cheekbones. That glance, never recorded in paint, lingers in the silence of the room long after the brushstrokes dried. You lean closer to one of the portraits, your breath fogging the imagined varnish. The boy in the frame stares back, stiff in his tailored coat. Somewhere nearby, another boy of the same age polishes the floor, his features almost identical. One is frozen in dignity, the other erased in service. Both carry the same blood. Step back now, and the entire parlour feels staged, like a theatre set. The portraits perform permanence, but the silence around them tells another story. The truth didn't disappear, it just wasn't painted. The walls of the big house hung heavy with absence, every empty frame a reminder of children who would never be seen except in the reflections of others' faces. You step out of the parlour and into a quieter study, where the master's will lies folded neatly on his desk. The air feels thick here, like the room itself knows what's missing from those pages. Inheritance was the final curtain call, the moment when silence turned into stone, chiseling away at any trace of shadow families. A solid historical fact. Most enslaved children fathered by masters received nothing in official wills. Even if a man had raised them within his household, even if their resemblance was undeniable, the law recognized them only as property unless he explicitly freed them. And freedom itself was rare. At best, a master might quietly manumit a favored child or provide a small sum of money, gestures too meager to bridge the gap between kinship and denial. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some wills contain peculiar clauses. A man might leave special consideration to a faithful servant without naming names, or he might list mulatto children under a vague category of gifts. Scholars digging through dusty courthouses sometimes stumble across these cryptic lines, tiny cracks in the facade, proof that the master's conscience flickered in his final days, though never brightly enough to name the truth outright. Picture the legitimate heirs gathered after the funeral, their voices hushed but tense. They unroll the parchment, reading the elegant script that divides land, silver, and livestock. Every item accounted for, every acre claimed, but no mention of the children who stand just outside the window, staring in with eyes that mirror their fathers. Those children will inherit nothing but silence, their bloodline erased by omission. Historians still argue whether this denial was cold pragmatism, protecting estates from scandal, or whether it revealed the deep hypocrisy at the heart of the planter class. Did these men truly not feel a bond with their shadow children, or did they simply decide that wealth mattered more than recognition? The evidence suggests both. Imagine the bitterness in those moments. A boy who had carried books for his father, or a girl who had served him meals, watches the man's legitimate sons claim everything: the land, the house, the legacy. The shadow children remain nameless, their futures tied to whether someone else decides to keep or sell them. You can almost hear the paper crinkle as the will is folded shut, the wax seal pressed down with finality. Outside, the enslaved community whispers the truth, passing it along so it will not be forgotten. The big house may deny inheritance, but memory is its own kind of legacy, one not bound by ink or law. As you leave the study, the silence clings to you. The wealth of the master is secured, but the cost is written in absence. Inheritance denied, lives unrecorded, shadows lingering just beyond the reach of parchment. You step from the study into a smaller sitting room where books and pamphlets lie scattered on a side table. Some are worn novels, their spines cracked from reading. Others are thin religious tracts and political essays. But tucked among them you find something curious, fiction that whispered truths society dared not say aloud. A grounded historical fact: long before the Civil War, writers began slipping veiled references to shadow families into print. Abolitionist authors in particular used novels and pamphlets to expose the hypocrisy of slavery, often through thinly disguised characters: a plantation master with a suspiciously large number of mulatto servants, or a child who bore an uncanny resemblance to the man who claimed to own him. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin wasn't the only one. Dozens of smaller works circulated in pamphlets, sermons, and serialized stories. And here's the quirky tidbit: even white Southern novelists sometimes hinted at these realities, though cloaked in euphemism. They might describe a servant as of peculiar parentage, or note the remarkable fairness of a slave child, without explaining further. Readers knew, they always knew. Literature became a place where the unspoken could be acknowledged indirectly, disguised as imagination, but rooted in plain fact. Picture a young woman in Boston reading one of these pamphlets aloud to her family, her voice trembling as she reaches the passage about a child sold away from his enslaved mother, his father, a prominent man. The room falls silent, every listener recognizing the truth, even though the names were fictional. Stories carried what polite conversation refused to. Historians still argue whether these literary whispers changed minds or merely confirmed what abolitionists already believed. Some credit them with fueling the growing northern outrage that helped fracture the Union. Others argue they were dismissed by Southerners as slander, cheap fiction not worth acknowledging. But their power lingers in how often descendants recall hearing stories first through novels, not through family archives. Imagine now the mistress of a plantation sneaking a look at one of these books, her lips tightening as she reads a story that mirrors her own household too closely. Or a shadow child hearing rumors of such a novel, knowing their reality had been put into words, even if not into their father's will. Literature, fragile though it was, kept the whispers alive. You set the pamphlet back on the table, its pages rustling softly in the still air. The room feels heavier now, as though the walls know they've been betrayed by ink. For all the wealth and silence preserved in the big house, a few words printed on cheap paper could slip through cracks, carried northward by mailbags and memory. The big house silenced names, the law erased inheritance. But fiction had the nerve to say what portraits, ledgers, and wills never could. You walk outside again, the night air warm against your skin, and the horizon flickers faintly with the glow of campfires. It is the 1850s now, and the air across the south feels restless, brittle, full of static. The Civil War hasn't yet erupted, but the ground is cracking, and in those cracks the silence around shadow families becomes harder to hold. A firm historical fact: By the late antebellum years, the expansion of abolitionist movements, newspapers, and underground networks made it increasingly difficult for masters to keep their double lives hidden. Travelers from the north, journalists and missionaries wrote openly about the contradictions they witnessed: white children in parlors and mixed-race children laboring in fields just outside. Every account chipped away at the facade of plantation respectability. And here's the quirky tidbit. Southern politicians often railed against abolitionist lies, yet some of them secretly feared exposure through gossip more than any speech in Congress. A whispered rumor about a senator's shadow family could ripple faster than an editorial. Imagine trying to thunder about Southern virtue on the floor of Congress while knowing that your enslaved son might be standing barefoot in a field only miles from the Capitol. By the 1860s, war drew everything into the open. Shadow families could no longer remain invisible when armies marched through plantations, scattering households and pulling enslaved people into Union camps. Union soldiers recorded scenes that shocked even them. Children who looked exactly like the masters now fleeing the chaos of war. One soldier wrote of boys of near-white complexion, unmistakably the masters, left behind in fields with their mothers. Historians still argue whether the Civil War truly exposed these families or merely shifted how they were discussed. Some believe emancipation forced recognition of kinship ties long denied. Others argue most masters clung to denial until their dying breath. What's clear is that the silence cracked. War has a way of ripping curtains down, no matter how heavy the fabric. You can almost hear it now, cannons in the distance, the thrum of drums, voices shouting orders. The big house trembles as the world it propped up begins to collapse. Inside, the mistress paces, wringing her hands. The master writes frantic letters, his pen scratching furiously. And outside, shadow children gather with their mothers, uncertain whether freedom will bring acknowledgement or only new forms of abandonment. The campfires glow brighter. The night carries the scent of wood smoke and gunpowder. And through it all, you sense the silence breaking like glass, splintering underfoot. For generations, shadow families lived in whispers, but as war approaches, the whispers swell into something louder, undeniable, and impossible to erase. The war has come and gone now, leaving behind smoke, ruin, and silence of a different kind. You walk among the remains of a plantation yard in 1865. The fields lie untended, fences broken, and the big house windows stare out like hollow eyes. Emancipation has been declared, freedom etched into law, but freedom doesn't mean simplicity. For shadow families, the end of slavery brought new struggles of belonging. A grounded historical fact, the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, recorded countless petitions from formerly enslaved women and children seeking recognition, land, or support from the very men who had once owned them. Some shadow children approached their fathers openly now, demanding acknowledgement. Others tried to claim inheritance or at least legitimacy in court. More often than not, they were denied. The law had shifted, but denial proved stubborn. Here's the quirky tidbit. A handful of former masters actually did attempt to live with or provide for their shadow families after emancipation. Local newspapers sometimes reported these scandals with mocking tones, describing strange households where a white man resided with his mixed-race children in plain sight. For neighbors steeped in the old order, this was outrageous, even comical, but for the families themselves, it was survival, finally living together without the thin veil of secrecy. Historians still argue whether emancipation truly improved life for shadow families. Some scholars point to freedom as a doorway to education, property ownership, and visibility. Others note that many of these children remain trapped in cycles of poverty, shunned by both white society and sometimes even by free black communities, wary of their paternal ties. The debate lingers because the records are fragmentary, filled with gaps that silence still controls. Picture a boy of 15, once a servant in the big house, now standing in line at a Freedmen's Bureau office. He declares his name proudly, maybe for the first time. He writes it on paper, shaky letters that spell out his claim to existence. Behind him, his mother waits, her hand resting on his shoulder, her eyes fierce with hope. Outside, Union soldiers ride by, their uniforms dusty, their faces weary. The war has ended, but a different battle has just begun. You stand in that line with them, feeling the weight of history pressing forward. The old silence has cracked, but new silences wait ahead. Neighbors' whispers, employers' prejudices, the ache of still being denied kinship. Freedom came with paper and ink, but belonging was another matter. Shadow families had stepped into the light, only to discover that the light carried its own kind of shadows. The big house is crumbling now, ivy creeping up its walls. Its secrets no longer locked behind polished doors, but scattered across fields, courtrooms, and bureau records. You walk away slowly, hearing not the silence of repression, but the uneasy quiet of transition, the space between denial and recognition where families tried to piece themselves together out of fragments. The war's echoes fade, but the stories don't. You find yourself now in a small cabin in the 1870s, its hearth glowing faintly, its shelves lined with jars of beans and cornmeal. 3 generations sit together, an old woman with a lined face, her daughter sewing, and a young boy listening intently. The room hums with memory. This is where truth survived, not in courtrooms or ledgers, but in oral tradition. A solid historical fact. After emancipation, many freed families relied on storytelling to preserve their histories. With records fragmented or destroyed, memory became the archive. Grandmothers told children who their fathers were, even if those fathers never claimed them. Mothers whispered names that the law had erased. The stories passed from fire to fire, night to night, carried like sacred possessions. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some communities, nicknames carried entire histories. A boy called Massa's John or a girl teased as Little Missy bore identifiers that everyone understood. These weren't affectionate nicknames. They were coded acknowledgements, ways of keeping memory alive without writing a word. Some of those names still echo today in family lore, strange relics of silenced truths. Historians still argue how reliable these oral stories were. Some dismiss them as exaggerations or inventions born of bitterness. Others insist they're vital, that without them we'd know almost nothing of shadow families at all. Modern genealogists increasingly find that DNA testing corroborates what grandmothers whispered a century ago, truth hidden in blood, waiting to be confirmed. Picture the boy by the fire tonight. His grandmother leans close, her voice low but steady. Your grandfather wore fine boots, but he never called your mother by her name. Still you carry his eyes. The boy looks down, trying to understand. His mother stitches faster, her hands tight on the fabric. The truth hurts, but silence would hurt more. You glance around the cabin, the rafters creak, the fire snaps, and yet the room feels alive, charged with the electricity of memory being transferred. This isn't just a story, it's survival. For families who had been told they had no names, no history, no claim, storytelling reassembled what paper tried to burn. Step outside, and the night air wraps around you. Across the south, in cabins and small homes, in fields, and under church rafters, voices murmur the same truths. They do not fade. They are carried forward, stubborn and steady, long after the big house has fallen silent. Oral tradition is more than memory. It is defiance against erasure, a whispered archive of shadow families refusing to disappear. You move forward into the present day, where the old fields have turned into suburbs, highways and shopping centres. The big houses that remain are museums now, their gift shops selling postcards and paper fans. But in kitchens, living rooms and DNA testing labs, the shadows still stir. Descendants of those long-silenced families are piecing together identities once denied to their ancestors. A grounded historical fact. In the last few decades, genetic testing has revealed thousands of hidden bloodlines, confirming family stories whispered for generations. People who grew up with hazy hints, you've got the master's nose, our people once lived in that big house, now hold results in their hands, proof that blood ties were real all along. Some discover connections to prominent families, even presidents. And here's the quirky tidbit. Online forums now hum with conversations where distant cousins, black and white, realize they share an ancestor who was both master and enslaver. The exchanges range from joyful to awkward to explosive. Imagine logging on, clicking through your family tree and finding that your great-great-grandfather's shadow family is still out there, alive, posting photos of reunions on Facebook. For many descendants, recognition is complicated. Some embrace it, reaching out to long-lost relatives. Others recoil, preferring silence to the discomfort of tangled history. Historians still argue whether these revelations heal wounds or reopen them. Some say naming the truth is a necessary step toward justice. Others caution that acknowledgement without reparations risks repeating the old cycle of denial, dressed up as progress. Picture a woman opening her DNA test results at her kitchen table. Her hand shake as she reads the names. Names she's seen on street signs, courthouse plaques, even the gilded frames of portraits in southern mansions. Her grandmother's whispers come rushing back. We had white blood in us, though no one would admit it. The results confirm it. She feels both vindicated and hollow, as though the shadows she carried are suddenly glaring in daylight. You stand with her in that quiet moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Outside, cars pass, children ride bikes, the world spins on. But for her, time has collapsed. The big house, the quarters, the whispered names, the broken wills, all of it folds into this instant of recognition. She is both herself and the echo of every ancestor who lived in denial's shadow. The pain of recognition is sharp, but it also brings clarity. The shadows are no longer invisible. They stretch across generations, across faces, across DNA strands. And in the end, they whisper the same truth. We were here. We always were. You drift now into the echo chamber of academia, where the voices aren't whispers, but arguments bouncing back and forth across lecture halls and journals. Scholars lean over stacks of dusty ledgers, compare DNA results, pass old letters, and ask the same question. Just how common were shadow families? A solid historical fact, evidence of enslavers fathering children with enslaved women, exists in nearly every slaveholding society, from Virginia tobacco farms to Louisiana sugar plantations, but the scale remains uncertain. Some researchers argue it was widespread, almost inevitable in a system built on absolute power. Others suggest it was uneven, concentrated among the wealthiest planters who had greater access to enslaved households. And here's the quirky tidbit. Even in the 20th century, some Southern families privately joked or whispered nervously that every family has a branch we don't talk about. The half-joke, half-confession shows how deeply the truth lingered, unacknowledged, but never erased. It was common enough to be folklore, taboo enough to avoid daylight. Historians still argue about interpretation. Was this abuse an exception that scandalized neighbors, or a norm hidden behind polite denial? The debate sometimes grows heated because the answer reshapes how we understand the fabric of slavery itself. If shadow families were exceptions, then they are tragedies of individual hypocrisy. If they were the rule, then they reveal slavery as a system shot through with sexual violence, denial, and contradictions at its core. You imagine two scholars at a conference table, voices rising as they argue. One gestures toward plantation records pointing at cryptic notes and mulatto notations. The other insists the evidence is anecdotal, not proof of universality. Around them, the audience scribbles notes, some nodding, some frowning, the debate looping in circles. Yet both sides know the truth lies in the silences as much as in the data. Meanwhile, descendants outside the academy live with those silences daily. A grandmother's whispered story doesn't need a footnote to be real. A DNA test doesn't wait for peer review to confirm a lineage. You can almost hear the disconnect. Historians debating definitions while families already know in their bones what the records tried to hide. The arguments will go on, filling books, lectures, and symposiums. But as you linger in the quiet afterward, you realize something. History's debates don't erase lived reality. Shadow families were not theoretical. They were flesh and blood, laughter and grief, survival and silence. Whether exception or rule, their existence changed every table where silence reigned every ledger that hinted at truth, every portrait that left faces out of the frame. And as you step back into the night air, the academic voices fade. What remains are the shadows themselves, families that lived, endured, and now demand to be remembered, no matter how fiercely scholars argue. You step once more into the quiet night, where the big house looms faintly in the distance, its windows dark, its walls crumbling under ivy. The voices inside are gone now, but the whispers remain. You walk slowly down the path between the house and the quarters, where grass has grown tall, where footsteps once beat daily grooves into the earth. The air feels softer, almost tender, as though the land itself is exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. You pause, listening. In your mind you can still hear them, the hush of servants in the dining room, the muffled laughter of children chasing fireflies, the faint scratching of a quill across a ledger. The silence is full of echoes like ghosts brushing against your sleeve. They are not frightening ghosts, not here. They are weary, persistent, longing simply to be remembered. The big house is no longer a stage for denial. Its portraits hang dusty in museums, its ledgers studied by strangers. The descendants of both sides, masters' heirs and shadow children's heirs, live together in a world that is louder, more complicated, more honest than the one their ancestors knew. The shadows have lengthened into daylight. The secrets are no longer secret. And so you slow your steps. Your breath matches the rhythm of the crickets. The night air grows cooler, softer, wrapping around you like a blanket. Every contradiction, every silence, every story you've wandered through tonight begins to dissolve into the stillness, the shame, the denial, the whispered truths. They settle into the earth like fallen leaves, not erased, but part of the soil now. You find a spot beneath an old tree and sit down. The branches sway gently, the leaves rustling like lullabies. Above you, the stars scatter across the sky, endless and calm. The past has been heavy, but the night is forgiving. Here you can let go. You close your eyes, breathing deeply, listening to the hum of the world as it quiets around you. And as sleep begins to gather at the edges of your mind, you feel those voices, once hushed, once hidden, fading into the rhythm of the night. They do not vanish, they simply rest, waiting for memory to call them again. The echoes soften, the silence smooths, and the shadows finally lie still. Now let yourself drift. The lights are low, the fan hums softly, and the world grows hushed. The story has ended, the voices have quieted, and you are safe here. Rest easy, knowing the past has spoken and settled.